Today, part two of what we ought to admit about ourselves so we can realize something better.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
Last time, what we discussed in leading up to this part of the conversation is a more realistic view of ourselves. And I mean that primarily as believers, but just our condition in the world, that we have a really high estimate of our moral ability, what we can accomplish morally in the world, and what we ought to acknowledge. And this is simple for believers, you would think. What we ought to acknowledge is that we're a lot more dependent on God's grace than we like to admit, which is strange. You would think we would relish in that. But instead, we sort of relish in our own moral accomplishments. Hey, I've had a pretty good day today. I think I'll go and pray with confidence today. And so we addressed all of why that needed to be pulled back a little. More humility on our part invites a better understanding of what we need to talk about today, which has such an important implication for how we understand the moral obligations that we continually face in the world. Because as people, just as human beings, I think our psyches can only stand confrontation for so long. We can only look at something that's uncomfortable for so long, and then we turn away from it. It doesn't matter how magnificent the movie Schindler's List is. You don't watch it over and over again. It doesn't matter how important Life is Beautiful is as a movie. You just can't watch it over and over. It's too painful. And yet the reality of it is still there. So why aren't we looking at it all the time? When I finished my dissertation, which included chapters on moral atrocities that were committed in the mid-20th century, of which there were an abundance, I couldn't look at the topic for years. I just could not go back to it, and I did not want to think about it, which is an embarrassment, but it's part of human nature that we turn away from it. And it's the same way if we're hearing every day what a failure we are, how we have messed up, what we haven't done right, what in our heritage is continually clinging to us in uncleanness and so on. You just eventually you turn away from it. You're like, we're good enough. So I don't want to hear that anymore. And so what I want us to do is realize that when we become believers, we adopt an attitude that becomes more accepting of the guilt that we bear, more accepting of the things that are not okay about us yet, and therefore is able to look at the duties we have, the obligations, responsibilities, the moral requirements that we have, and give a more honest assessment about whether we're achieving them or not. And so as we're having this part of the discussion, hopefully it will make sense why we had to build on the grounds that we did. And I'll come back to that about mid-discussion here. So, first let's pause and take a look at the nature of our duty, which is, it's a word that's used so broadly. So, your duties include taking out the trash. In moral terms, what we mean when we talk about a duty is an obligation, a thing you have to do. It's a moral imperative. So, you have the obligation to keep your promises or whatever it is. We'll talk about that one in just a moment. And so, the one way to understand our duty, our moral obligation in the world is just to look at it, strictly from the perspective that Jesus gives it in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Golden Rule. And this is, obviously a rule so broad, people associate it not only with the words of Jesus, but also with teachings that come from other cultures as well. And it seems to be a really applicable understanding of what our duty is to each other. And so the Golden Rule, the way he puts it, is that you should, and I'll word it in my own paraphrase first, and then I'll say it a different way, but that we have to do or act or make toward others what you would have them do or act or make toward you. And I choose the do, act, or make language because the word that's used in the New Testament is a really broad word for just all the things that we do. But so the way we read that, unfortunately, Matthew 7:12, the quotation, and I'll take it from the ESV here, is, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And unfortunately, we take that, and I've said this many times before, and you've probably heard me say it if you've ever listened to me before. We abuse the language of that into a wish kind of idea. That is, well, I see somebody on the side of the road that needs help. I better stop and help them because someday I'm going to be on the side of the road, and I want to make sure they help me too. Like I'm really trying to get something for myself by following the golden rule. That's not what this is about, and it's clear from the whole context of Matthew 7 that that's not what this is about. That what's happening by the time you get to Matthew 7:12 is that we're realizing the statements at the beginning of the chapter, judge not lest you be judged. That is, that you don't apply any rules to others that you don't apply to yourself. You don't give yourself any excuses that you don't also give to others. That whatever it is you do or act or make regarding others, you also do or act or make regarding yourself, and you expect them to do the same, and they expect you to do the same. So you have the same obligations everyone else has. This is the idea behind Matthew 7:12, and it's what makes sense of saying this is the law and the prophets, because the idea that all of the 10 commandments, the idea that the great commandment, that we not only love the Lord, but love one another, that I love others with the same regard that I give to myself, makes perfect sense in light of the golden rule then, and the law and the prophets hanging on it makes sense as well, because that's the one rule that where even Jesus says all the law and the prophets hang on loving your neighbor as yourself in context of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? And so, another way to word that, the golden rule, is a way that some ethicists have put it in the past, and we'll talk about one of them in particular in a moment, but it is act only on the basis of what reason would require of everyone in such a circumstance. That is, when you're facing a moral decision, you have to make the decision based on what could rationally be extrapolated to everyone else to do in that situation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing what's moral. You'd just be doing what's most effective for you, or most practical for you, or most desirable for you. But practice and desire and effectiveness are not the same as moral. It's a different word. It means something else. So how do you get to that? And yes, I'm expounding a Kantian view of ethics right now, which I think makes sense. He was raised by pietists, and he knows he's carrying forward the golden rule in the categorical imperative that he gives. All that language is secondary. You don't have to worry about it. I just wanted to make the point for those of you who are familiar with ethics discussions that I know I'm talking about Kant here. Of course, that's the point. But there are other ways to understand what that means than simply to get into a situation and try to figure it out on the basis of universalizing things, this completely theoretical discussion. There are some really practical, and I mean by this, intuitive. Everybody just sort of knows there are certain things that we ought to do, certain moral obligations that we have regarding each other. Now, I'm bringing this up not so we can talk about this list of moral obligations, but so that we can finally come to understand why it might be the case that we're never capable of doing enough good to give ourselves a pat on the back and say, oh, I'm finally a good boy. I have finally arrived. But still do have a moral obligation we can fulfill and that we must fulfill. How on earth those two things can go together requires us to sort of understand this foundation that we lay. And so I'm going to take William David Ross is a mid-20th century philosopher, ethicist, who followed Kant's approach to ethics, but also added to it this intuitive sense that, and intuition, I know people only think of it as women's intuition or something like that. Intuition is just the idea that you have some things you know, even if you don't know how you know them or you don't know why you know them, but you do know them. You're not guessing at them. You don't just believe them sort of strongly. You know that these things are the case. And even if you could prove them, you don't need to because you just know them. And so what William David Ross gives is an intuitionist approach to ethics, but combined with Kant, with an understanding of the categorical imperative, the fact that we have duties that we have to fulfill. It's in ethics, it's called deontology from this Greek word de, which means necessity, of necessity. You ought to do this. So the imperatives that we have to do, according to William David Ross, are just obvious to us. But there are several of them, and he lists 7. I think we normally now reduce it to about 3 that we would say we have an obligation to do. Maybe 4. I would probably put 4 in the list. But he starts with 7, and we can talk about another day about what the 4 would be. Anyway, so his list is really simple. And it's based on duties that seem obvious on the relationship that we have with other people and with ourselves. So duties created by things that I've done in the past, duties that are created by others, things that others have done, duties that are based on what other people need, duties that are based on just the fact that other people exist and on my own existence and on my respect for others and so on. So here's the list of 7 obligations or duties. And these are called prima facie duties. You know what prima facie is, at first face. I mean, you just know these. That's what I mean by saying they're intuitive. On face value, you know you should keep your promises. Otherwise, you wouldn't make a promise. So making a promise is saying, oh, and by the way, I'll keep my promise. It's absurd to have to say, I promise I'll do it. Oh, and by the way, I'll keep my promise. Except that so many people fail to keep their promises, which we already view as a moral failure. So we know you ought to keep your promises. Gratitude is one of his prima facie duties. When others have done something for us, it is, we know there's something wrong with someone who's not grateful for what others have done for them. I could go on and on, but surely you understand. This is why Memorial Day seems so important to us. It's why our observance of the sacrifice others have made on our behalf becomes so important. How ungrateful must a person be? Well, you get it. So you could go on lecturing about it. That's not the point today. I'm lecturing myself now to stop lecturing. So promise keeping is one of them. Gratitude is one. Reparations is one. People use different words for this, and reparations, that's scary language in our culture. But I mean, it simply means duties that are based on what other people need, and especially other people's needs that we have caused. So if I've done something wrong, I have to right that wrong. If others have done something wrong and I can do something about it, I should right that wrong. That obligation to fix things that I have broken, or in some cases to fix things that even others have broken and that affects other people, you know, we're not just talking about dishes here, is reparations. That's the idea of reparation. These next 2 come together. These are prima facie duties, things we all ought to know we have to do. Sharing. When others have a need and I'm able to meet the need, I ought to meet the need. I should share. If I have an abundance, I should share with others. We start teaching it to our 2- and 3-year-olds, not because we want them to be inculcated in some arbitrary rule that we've decided about in our culture, but because we think our children would be monsters if they didn't learn to do it. It's prima facie, an obligation that we have to share with one another, which is why this next one sort of gets lumped in with it. It's a separate category, but it's benevolence. That we owe it to others to be good to them, to do good unto others, to act kindly to others. Benevolence is a word that ends up being thrown onto things like soup kitchens, you know, feeding the poor, or giving money to organizations, institutions that do nonprofit work, for instance. Then you are a source of benevolence for them. And so that idea of doing good for others, whatever instigates it, and whether it's considered sharing or just an act of benevolence, is still a duty that's based on the fact that other people exist and have needs that we might be able to meet. Next, on the list of prima facie duties, self-improvement. And those are just duties based on the fact that I exist as a human being. And I could go into this one for a long time, but part of my understanding of who I am, of what it is to be a self, is that there is a narrative of my existence, that I begin one way and end another way, but that I am the same person throughout. And that and this is prima facie, my duty as that person is to improve along the way, not to get worse, not to become a more terrible person. No one gets a pat on the back and says, well, you've never been that bad before. Good for you. I mean, the good for you is, wow, you learn to, when you're kids, you learn to read. All right, you learned how to read. This is fantastic. Now you've graduated, and look at that, you're able to do a job, and so on. That stuff, the pat on the back, comes from self-improvement, and we all know that we should be improving, we should be learning, we should be growing, we should be gaining. This is why I love doing higher education, especially in the Christian world, where we have a tendency towards complacency. Once we get to something that's successful, and this is our pragmatic nature coming out in us as Americans, once we do something that's fairly successful, we think, oh, that's it. That's what everybody needs to do. That's how everybody else ought to do it. I already know how to do it, so I don't need to improve. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing now. Part of the reason I love doing higher education, and I'm the president of Criswell College, I love being at Criswell College, is because we don't let people sit on their laurels. We're always saying, but how do we do that better? How do we make it closer to Scripture? How do we reflect these truths that come from God more honestly in our lives? And how do we be more honest about ourselves, which is part of the reason for the discussion today, self-improvement. Anyway, self-improvement is one of those prima facie duties. And then finally, non-maleficence, do no harm is the idea. And these are duties based on our independence. That is, our respect for others as people who deserve as much regard as we do. So if I wouldn't want people slapping me in the face, then I don't want to go around slapping other people in the face. And I can claim that I have liberty, but, only as far as my fist doesn't reach their nose, to use the old meme. Yeah. We can call it a meme now, I think. So we'll see. Anyway, so there you've got the idea of the basic duties. Again, promise-keeping, gratitude, reparation, sharing, benevolence, self-improvement, and non-maleficence. And again, it's not like you memorize that list. Others would simplify it to autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Those four things. Whatever terms you put on it, there are just some things we know that we owe each other. There are certain things we know that we owe the world, or that we owe ourselves, or ultimately, as believers, we would say that we owe God, that we ought to be doing these things. Those are our duties. With that laid, we have a nice little theory, right? Okay, well, fine. You've got a way you think about ethics. Who really cares? Well, we need now to take a couple of steps back into the reality of what we have to deal with in this world in order to understand the point of this two-part discussion. So those two steps back to reality begin first with acknowledging this. So here I have a prima facie duty to keep my promises, and I have a prima facie duty to benevolence, to helping other people when I can help them. So I've got two obligations that I need to keep. I want to read to you. Now, it's very possible, and this is the first step back into reality. And by reality, I don't mean the theory's not real, or that rationality is not real, or that, ethereal things cannot be real. They can be, and they are. I believe in that. But by reality, I mean into the real world where we live. So now, how do we put feet to these ideas? How do we live them out? And the first step back to it is admitting that moral dilemmas may place prima facie duties in opposition. Remember, in the last discussion, a week ago, we brought up that there are moral dilemmas that are used to sort of clarify how we understand our ethics. Moral dilemmas where you have two choices, and either one, you're forced to choose one or the other, but either one violates the other side. So you're put on the horns of a dilemma, and you don't know how to escape. One way or another, you're going to have to do something wrong, betray your Jewish friend into the closet, or lie to the Nazi at the door. One way or the other, you're going to have to do something wrong. This seems terrible. It's a moral dilemma. What are we going to do? Okay, so the first step back into reality, after we have these 7 prima facie duties that we understand, or 4, however many you put on it, doesn't matter. After you have these prima facie duties you understand, is that those prima facie duties may be put in opposition to each other by a moral dilemma. So I'm going to read you a little section from a book called The Good and the Right. It's written by William David Ross, the guy I mentioned earlier. And and in it, he's sort of responding to G.E. Moore's utilitarianism. And so he says, Moore's utilitarianism says, Utilitarianism, by the way, for people who don't do ethics at all, utilitarianism is a view that says you do what brings about the most happiness, the most good for the most people for the greatest amount of time, and so on. And Moore's utilitarianism has a certain spin on that. But it doesn't matter to this. You'll get the point from William David Ross anyway. So he says that kind of utilitarianism says, in effect, that the only morally significant relation in which my neighbors stand to me is that of being possible beneficiaries by my action. So now my only moral obligation is I'm commenting now, not reading William David Ross at this moment. So what he's saying is the way utilitarianism works, the only way my neighbor relates to me is as someone who could receive something good from me. So when I'm trying to decide what the good thing is to do, I just look at them and say, well, how can I produce the most happiness in them? And William David Ross says that's not good enough, because while they do stand, now I'm quoting him again, they do stand in this relation to me, and this relation is morally significant, but they may also stand to me in the relation of promisee to promisor, of creditor to debtor, of wife to husband, of child to parent, of friend to friend, of fellow countryman to fellow countryman, and the like. And each of these relations is the foundation of a prima facie duty, which is more or less incumbent on one according to the circumstances of the case. When I'm in a situation, I'm still quoting William David Ross, when I'm in a situation, as perhaps I always am, in which more than one of these, get this language, this is the point. When I am in a situation, as perhaps I always am, that's the second point we'll come to in a moment. When I'm in a situation, as perhaps I always am, in which more than one of these prima facie duties is incumbent on me, what I have to do is to study the situation as fully as I can until I form the considered opinion, and it's never more than a considered opinion, that in the circumstances, one of them is more incumbent than any other. Then I am bound to think that to do this prima facie duty is my duty sans phrase in the situation. Sans phrase is it's a Latin phrase that people use. I assume it's Latin for, without qualification, sans phrase, without any additional phrases, right? So what that means is it's my actual duty. And that's the way people talk about William David Ross. In addition to having prima facie duties, I have actual duties. I have things in given situations that I have to respond to with an actual with an act that actually takes place, not just a theory that says, well, I can't lie to the Nazi at the door, and I can't betray my friend in the closet. What will I do? I'll just pass out. No, I have to do something in that situation, and whatever it is I choose to do, wherever I say, well, this duty is more incumbent on me, that becomes my actual duty. Now, that's just straight up William David Ross. And I think it's a really good way to analyze what's going on with us normally, and it confronts something true about the world and about our ethical obligations that we don't like to admit. And so this would be the second step. The first step to take all those prima facie duties and bring them back into reality is recognize that they might face opposition with each other every once in a while. So, for instance, I always joke, I say it lightly this way. I have a duty to be on time to teach a class. And so I'm supposed to be there at 10, but I see somebody on the side of the road bleeding at, 5 minutes till 10, and I need to help them. So I stop and I get them to a hospital and so on, and I miss my class altogether, or I'm an hour late for my class, and my students would wait. It's worth it, you see. Anyway, the point is, I show up late, or I show up the next week. When I show up late, I have failed to keep my obligation to the class. You say, well, yeah, but it made sense because you had to help that guy get to the hospital. And obviously, that was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But what do I say to my class? Do I say, yeah, you're right, I didn't show up. None of your cotton-picking business. I went to the hospital. I was doing something important while you guys were just sitting here waiting for me to teach. No. I don't scold them, and I don't act proud and arrogant. Well, I did the right thing, after all. It's not like I owed you anything. No. What do we say? I would walk into the class the next week or an hour late, and I would say, hey, I'm sorry I was late. Why am I sorry? Because I broke my obligation to them. I looked at a classroom full of people, and I said I have something more important to do than keep my promise to you. That's violating my obligation to them. I did the right thing in the moment. I got the guy to the hospital and saved his life. but I also did something wrong regarding my students. This really bothers people. Somehow or another, we think it must be right for me to have broken my promise to show up at class on time, since it was the right thing for me to do to take that person to the hospital. But think of what it means for me to say it must have been right for me to break that promise. Not only am I saying, well, breaking your promises, keeping your promises, you do it when you want, you don't do it when you don't want. There's that problem. But there's also the problem that I'm assuming about the world, that it's morally, that perfection is morally achievable in this world. I'm saying in every situation, there is this golden reality in nature that says whatever you do will be right as long as you make the right choice. No harm will be done. Why would I think that about a fallen world? We don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world waiting for redemption. Why wouldn't we acknowledge that we can't be perfect? Because, in one sense, we respond immediately with, oh no, then everybody's just going to go willy-nilly, do whatever they want. It's all relativism and all the way down the slope to, perdition from there. But it's not. Because intuitively, I know what my obligations are. And when I'm confronted with more than one obligation, I know I need to do something right as much as I possibly can. And you would think that I would then know as well that if I'm doing the most right I can do, I might still be, and in fact I indeed am, short of the perfection that I would have if I had not ever fallen, if I had not been born into a world filled with failure. But I am. That's the world I live in. So anyway, this first step is just this. First step back into reality from all this theory stuff we've been talking about is just acknowledging that moral dilemmas can place prima facie duties in opposition to each other. But then second, and this step is much more difficult for us. We don't like this one. That it may be the case, and in fact, it obviously is the case, I think if we think about it long enough, and W.D. Ross implied this, every time we fulfill one obligation, every single time we fulfill one obligation, we are neglecting another. Even if we're not directly violating something, even if we're not actively doing something we would consider wrong, simply by not doing the other things that we ought to be doing, that are prima facie duties for us, we are neglecting another. So every single time we fulfill one prima facie obligation, we are neglecting another prima facie obligation. The dilemmas above that I gave you when we were talking last week about the examples of moral dilemmas, right? Those dilemmas are an example of it, and we can talk about them again. I mean, not only the Jew at the door and Jew in your closet, Nazi at the door example, but the one I was talking about where people are carrying Bibles into closed countries, for example. All of those have prima facie duties that are coming into conflict with each other. The ectopic pregnancy example that I was giving you, the obligation you have to do something to save your baby's life, to respect the life of that child. At the same time, the obligation that you have to respect the life of your wife, the mother. These are obligations that can come in conflict to each other. When that happens, you would think we would open our eyes and say, oh, yeah, well, I guess sometimes my prima facie obligations do come into opposition against each other. And indeed, if I think broadly enough about the moral obligations I have in the world, which are endless, I'm never going to fulfill all the things I should do to repair the wrongs that have come into the world because of our sin. And this is another thing. We can't make any sense of original sin because we can't make any sense of how on earth we could be guilty of something that Adam did so long ago. It's not nearly as passive or mystical as we describe it. And so that's a discussion for another day. But I want to make the point here that on this second step back into the reality of what we face in this world, that every time we fulfill one obligation, we're neglecting another obligation, even if we're not directly violating. Evangelism is a simple example of that in believers' lives. So if you're not a believer, or if you're not active in your faith, in your Christianity, still hear this out to understand the dilemma that believers face when you talk about evangelism. If you do anything, even just sit in a worship service on a Sunday morning, you're not out sharing the gospel with someone. You're not out telling someone how to find Christ as Savior. And in that moment, people are walking by on the street who need to hear it. In the same way, if you go talk to X, you're not talking to Y. If you go to Macedonia, you're not going into Asia to share the gospel. You have to make choices. And the way people put it economically is opportunity cost. One of my students who's at Criswell, I teach ethics, and one of my students in an ethics class is a PPE major and was taking economics. And he was pointing out, oh, yeah, that's in economics. That's just opportunity cost. This is when you buy something, it doesn't just cost you the money you spent. It also costs you whatever else you would have bought with that money instead. So instead of having the money, you have this object. But instead of that object and the money, you could have had this other object. And now you can't get that. Opportunity cost is built into ethics as well. If you make the choice to do one right thing, you are neglecting the opportunity to do something else that's right, or sometimes actively choosing against something that you know is right. This is, by the way, not far removed philosophically, sort of more poetically, from The Road Not Taken, Robert Frost's brilliant poem, which is so abused in graduations, so take the lesser traveled road and you will be blessed in it, and it will make all the difference. That's not what the poem means at all. As you read through the poem, you realize that he's describing these two roads that diverge in a yellow wood. You know the poem, right? The Road Not Taken. Everybody quotes this poem. As you read through the poem, you realize he doesn't say this road was less traveled and therefore it made all the difference that I went the route other people don't go. It's not that. The whole point for him is, when I looked at the two roads, I looked on one and I looked down as far as I could where it bent into the undergrowth. I'm reading directly from it now. Then I took the other as just as fair. Not fairer, not worse, just as fair. And then he says, and perhaps, because he hasn't gone down it yet, he doesn't know, perhaps the better claim. So I'll try this one. But at the end of the day, when he's describing what happens on them, he doesn't say that one of them is actually better than the other. And in fact, in the very next lines, he says, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as far as that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden back. And then he says, but I chose one, I didn't go the other, and I'll always have these, not regrets that I went this way, but I'll have this nostalgia that goes back and says, oh, what if I had gone that way? Because that opportunity cost is gone. That poem, The Road Not Taken, is a perfect statement about what this moral cost is when we choose one thing over another. You can't do everything right that you're supposed to do, and that gives no excuse whatsoever for not doing what good you can. In the moment where you are trying to fulfill this prima facie obligation that you have to keep a promise or to repair a wrong or to share in your abundance or to improve yourself or whatever it is, you've still got an obligation. You have an obligation to do something. But in doing it, there will always be this acknowledgement of what you didn't do. And this is why I brought up before, and I will always use these as examples. The Hebrew midwives, should they lie? Of course not. But should they save the Hebrew children? Of course they should. It's a beautiful thing they're doing to save those lives. And it's not hierarchical, like God says, oh, lying's okay now. It is a reality that they're violating one moral obligation in order to keep another moral obligation. So what do we do with that? Just say they're not guilty, or say they're dependent on God's grace? Because that's what we are, dependent on God's grace. This is where our own fallen nature and the world's condition comes back into play in this discussion. The predicament for believers is fairly straightforward. Look, let's say we acknowledge that there are sins as we say it casually, but this is true in Scripture. There are sins of omission and there are sins of commission. We know this from the Old Testament and sacrifices that have to be offered for things people don't even know they did. We'll offer these sacrifices for the things you weren't aware of. And you will just acknowledge to God the guilt that you bear for things you didn't even know you did, or things that you didn't do that you didn't realize you omitted. Sins of omission are just as important as sins of commission. And if they really are both important, where you actually do something, commission, where you commit something, if they really are both important, then why do we give ourselves a pass on the things we're neglecting? Even while I sit here and record this, which I think is really important and my obligation for this morning to do, I am not feeding the hungry. I am not meeting with a pastor who spoke to our students in chapel yesterday and shared about how to get involved in your community and actually bring about a resurgence of life and vitality and certainly representation of the gospel in an otherwise decrepit community. I would love to spend the time in that community today, but instead I'm here. Why would I not admit that that is a loss? That is a moral loss that's not happening. So sins of omission and commission bring into sort of focus this reality that we shouldn't give ourselves a pass on these things. And if that's the case, if we can't give ourselves a pass on it, then believers, even those who live in the grace of Christ, believers on their own merit, would still be under condemnation. But I mean, that's an important phrase, isn't it? On their own merit. On our own merit, we would still be under condemnation, no matter how hard we tried, because we can't fix the world we broke. It's not possible for us to make right all the things we've done wrong. And so this is why I said last week, every single day, we depend not on how well we lived the day before, but on the grace of God for our very existence. People respond to this. It's really funny when I say this. I say funny. I mean ironic, sad, miserable. I don't know what it is. It's just surprising to me how often this happens. When I bring this up, when I bring up this topic, I get a lot of response, and it depends on the subject of the discussion, on how people respond. On some subjects, the ones they're comfortable attacking, they're like all in. Oh yeah, this is absolutely true. On the ones they're not as comfortable about, they respond with questions like, well, don't you believe in forgiveness? Don't you believe in the power of the cross? Don't you believe in God's mercy? Don't you think the blood of Christ can cleanse us from all sin? And so on. And it's ironic because, of course, I believe those things. That's the point of God's grace. What I don't believe is that we stop sinning the moment we repent and are forgiven. What I don't believe is that I don't really need God's grace anymore because once he gave it to me, I became so good, I didn't have anything else that needed to be forgiven. I don't believe that at all. Even our sincerest and purest effort is insufficient to compensate for the obligations we fail to meet. And no one's effort, and let's make no mistakes about this, no one's effort is entirely sincere or pure. That would be absurd. We don't exist as simple beings. We are complex. So do I believe in forgiveness? Of course, I believe in forgiveness for the very reason that I can never be in a place where I don't need forgiveness. I believe in the power of the cross for the very reason that I don't have a single moment of my life that could persist without the power of the cross. I believe in mercy for the very reason that there will never be a moment when I don't utterly depend on it from God, not because I have attained this level of holiness that gives obvious evidence that mercy is realized in me. I'll never achieve that. That doesn't mean that I don't have a goal, that I don't have perfection to pursue. And so, again, I want to emphasize this, the reaction to these claims that I'm making. It's so strong. If I'm talking about, for instance, an issue like abortion that's been around for 50 years in our culture and will continue to be a serious problem in our culture, even after Roe v. Wade is overturned, if it is, and I assume it will be. When I bring up that subject and I say we bear this guilt, most of the conservatives around are fairly comfortable with that. But other people are like, oh, that's absurd. No, that's ridiculous. You'd be guilty all the time. The same thing happens when I bring up racism as something that is structurally built into the way that we live in our culture, something built into our systems. So systemic racism. When I bring that up, the strength of the resistance to our constancy in sins like that serves me as evidence that, number one, we don't grasp how much we depend on God's grace, and number two, of how proud we are of ourselves. Oh, look at what we have achieved. Why, we have attained the glorious millennium on this earth. Why would we think that? We don't live in a perfect world. We are not perfect beings, and even in our forgiven condition, don't attain to the holiness of God in perfection until we see Him face to face. Why would we have a hard time admitting on issues like relieving suffering, ending abortion, stopping systemic racism, or at least acknowledging that it exists, addressing the hunger of the people who are around us, or the needs of refugees who come to us seeking deliverance from crises that have driven them from their homes? Why, when we see those things, do we respond by saying, no, we can't have that much obligation. Nobody could fulfill all of that. I mean, that's just too much. You're putting too much guilt on us. And the answer would be either because we don't grasp grace, or because we're proud, or both. The fact that we are no longer under condemnation because of grace does not mean we're under no obligation to pursue holiness. I don't mean that at all. So hear this again. The fact that we are no longer under condemnation due to grace doesn't mean that we have no obligation to pursue holiness, to demonstrate better in this world the product of the Spirit. So I could say it again this way. The fact that we own perfection, God has given it to me as a gift. This is imputed to me by Him, by His grace, by His declarations that He has given me this forgiveness. The fact that I own perfection doesn't mean that I have embodied that perfection. I don't have time to go into it right now, but Descartes deals with this in his ontological argument in some ways. And the fact that there is a perfection that we don't see in this world, but we know we're headed towards it. And we know that perfection exists because we want the things that head towards it. The fact that we don't achieve perfection doesn't mean we should not or cannot move toward it. And we should. And that's what I believe in doing in this world. But all the time that I'm taking steps toward it, I have to be acknowledging that I have not yet attained it. If I believe I've attained it, I stop stepping. If I don't believe I've attained it, I might get lazy and say, well, I can't get to the peak. I might as well just camp here. But the obligation of the believer, the obligation of those of us who want to do what I think God has specifically called us to do in this life is to say, yeah, that's true, that I have not obtained it, that I still carry my own failures day to day and live in the forgiveness and grace that God gives me in light of that. But I also take one step at a time so that I can move toward that perfection. Here's the point that I just want us to take home with us. Number one, a humbler view of ourselves and whether we've achieved the good that we think we've achieved or not. A humbler view of ourselves invites correction. Correction invites improvement. On the negative side, admitting that what we need to eliminate or regularly fail to eliminate is something we ought to address. On the positive side, seeing that what we can do, we haven't yet done. We can do more, and we start doing the more. So correction invites improvement. And all of that is what I think, and I'll just use the language that comes from 2 Corinthians. It's in a particular context, but it's broadly applicable to believers. And that's simply this. Since we have these promises, I'm leaving you with these words from Paul in 2 Corinthians. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion. That statement, bringing holiness to completion, in the King James is the words perfecting holiness, because it's just this present active participle, meaning we just keep doing this. We keep bringing the holiness that God has given us, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. We just keep bringing it closer and closer to what he has desired. So I leave you with Paul's words so that we would be perfecting holiness in the fear of God.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.